So if you're wondering, are the COVID policies really that bad? Like, what really necessitates all of this protest and so on and so forth? Well, let's just ask the question, shall we? Are COVID policies designed to help you or hurt you? And we'll start this segment off with an article here by Fraser Nelson in The Telegraph. Quote, "The lockdown establishment will never accept that its disastrous policy failed." Now, why do you think that might be? Surely if the policy failed, then they'll be able to put their hands up and say, it's a fair cop, we made a mistake, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think that's going to happen. He doesn't think that's going to happen. Do you think that's going to happen?
Absolutely not.
No, so what are they going to do you think? Double down? Just shift the subject, change the terms of the conversation, move on? Oh, look at this shiny thing instead. Who knows? But they're never going to admit fault. And he continues, "New research suggesting that shutdowns made little difference to mortality is likely to fall on deaf ears." We haven't heard much from Sir Patrick Vallance recently. A few weeks ago, he wrote an article extolling the reliability of SAGE modelers. "They speak scientific truth to power," he said.
They're in the power structures. How could they be speaking to power?
Right, exactly. He angrily rejected rumours of any negativity bias. Dozens of scenarios had been calculated for Omicron deaths, he said, with a huge range of variables. What I'd love to ask him is why, if there was no bias, did every single one of these scenarios end up overstating the threat? Why were they wrong, so wildly wrong, again? Why indeed? This isn't about parading Sir Patrick around Trafalgar Square with a placard of incorrect sage graphs around his neck, they say. No comment. The important question is whether he even thinks there was a problem, whether SAGE is capable of error correction, and what he thinks about the fact that the country was very nearly locked down on what turned out to be seriously duff advice. Given that it could happen again, and at any time, are lessons being learned, or are our scientific advisors still in collective denial? Now, I love the idea here, the sort of fantasy vision that he has, that someone might be held accountable. Like, never mind having placards around their neck or anything, just merely being held accountable for any of this nonsense that we've seen over the last 2 years.
Maybe denounce, because clearly their ideas don't work in public policy.
Right.
We shouldn't follow these in future.
Exactly. I mean, it seems like the last 2 years have been a brilliant case study in why scientists should perhaps not be running the country, the way many people have suggested over many years. In an era where all our lives are decided by the quality of epidemic modelling, the ability to scrutinise advice is vital. And I'm going to stop you there. Why are all our lives decided in this era by the quality of epidemic modelling? Isn't that a huge failure of our constitution, our democracy, our freedom, our way of life, everything? Why is it that free individuals, so-called free individuals, have their lives subject to the whim of some model, some scientific model about this sort of thing? I think when you compare the state of affairs now to previously in history, just that statement itself would seem absolutely horrifying to someone born 100 years ago. And with good reason, I would think. There we go. But SAGE models, he continues, are compiled within a wall of secrecy, protected from scrutiny. Their full figures are never published, nor is the code for them released. This makes error correction far less likely and constitutes a massive flaw in our democracy. The scary thing is that Vallance has had more power than any of us, says one cabinet member. Again, who elected Vallance? No one. He's theoretically there on merit, but of course the weight that you carry when you enter a position through merit is that you have to do the job meritoriously. You have to do it well. If you get into a position through merit and you completely screw it up, then you've got no right being there, and you should be held accountable. And he finishes off by saying, a recent Swedish book about the country's refusal to lock down uncovered emails from health officials saying, in effect, that since Imperial's Professor Neil Ferguson and his team got swine flu so badly wrong, their figures for Sweden's COVID deaths would probably be incorrect too. How do you think that turned out?
Incorrect?
Yeah. He wildly overestimated the figures. He estimated 500,000 deaths from COVID in the UK. I believe it's something like 3,000 under 65 with no other health conditions, underlying health conditions. But anyway.
Data, or what is it? In case anyone's wondering, I can't remember the website name Office for National Statistics, some far-right website.
Right. Given Ferguson, yes, it was a Freedom of Information request, I think, that revealed that. Given Ferguson's record, it was never clear why so much store was placed on his original suggestion that lockdown could potentially reduce COVID deaths by up to 98%. At the same time, even Sir Patrick and Sir Chris Whitty didn't buy it. Both rejected lockdown, then realised to their horror that they risked being accused in the media of causing an extra 20,000 deaths by failing to do so a week earlier. Even this figure came from Ferguson and has since been debunked. So again, you can sort of see how the power structures are at work here, and it's the pressure from media again that's forcing these people like Sir Patrick Vallance, like Sir Chris Whitty, who many criticisms are valid, to shift from their original position of there is no scientific evidence for lockdown back in March 2020 to let's do it because otherwise we're going to be accused of killing thousands of people.
But that gives us another new list of individuals who need to be held to account.
Yeah.
The mainstream media in this country is Sky News, the BBC, ITV, maybe Channel 4, who cares about them? But then you take those people, the people who are running the, let's say, political editing or whatever the hell it is, all of you need to be held to account too.
Yeah. Yeah, no question in my mind. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that our liberty collectively depends on Sir Patrick or his successor putting together a team capable of providing better epidemiological modelling, he says. Bloomin' hell, what a depressing world to live in when they have this amount of power. But no one elected them to these positions. Their models have been pretty unreliable, I think, is an understatement so far. And yet they have all of this power over us, how we live our daily lives, whether our pubs are open or not, whether we can go abroad, whether we can go to the next city, whether we can leave our homes, and the list goes on. And the study they cite here, moving on, is that COVID lockdown prevented only 0.2% of deaths in the first wave. Researchers say the costs of lockdowns to society far outweighed the benefits and argued that they should be rejected out of hand. Now, I've been saying this for 2 years. I think we've been pretty consistent on this point, that we don't really believe in lockdowns. And finally, the science is coming out and proving what's pretty obvious, I would say.
Well, the question was asked repeatedly from people in the, let's say, like alt media, where is the scientific evidence that lockdowns work? And no one ever gave an answer because there wasn't an answer.
No.
And now we have it. They didn't. Well, 0.2%. There you are.
Yeah, and people have also done analyses where they're saying, well, actually, this is going to torpedo our economy, and we had the largest recession in about 300 years because of the COVID shutdowns, and that's going to result in everyone being poorer, and we have reasonably clear correlations between the wealth of individuals and their life expectancy, so you could argue that if you're accounting in quality-adjusted life years, that lockdowns did far more harm than good. But that's just one angle of analysis. They continue. Researchers from Johns Hopkins University in the US, Lund University in Sweden, and the Center for Political Studies in Denmark said the cost to society far outweighed the benefits and called for lockdown to be rejected out of hand as a future pandemic policy. Hear, hear. The team even found that some lockdown measures may have increased deaths by stopping access to outdoor space, pushing people to meet at less safe places, while isolating infected people indoors where they could pass the virus on to family members and housemates. They also don't mention nosocomial infections in hospitals, which... Anyway, we do find some evidence that limiting gatherings was counterproductive and increased COVID-19 mortality, the authors concluded. Often, lockdowns have limited people's access to safe outdoor places such as beaches, parks and zoos, or included outdoor mask mandates or strict outdoor gathering restrictions, pushing people to meet at less safe indoor places. Because let's face it, who wants to go to a party where you're wearing a mask for 3 hours and can't see anyone's face?
It's not a party.
Exactly. I don't really know what to say here. It seems very obvious, and we have a look at the study here. And if you scroll down to page 5 on this reader, you can see they've got a graph at the bottom. And this is the correlation between the stringency index and COVID-19 mortality in European countries and US states during the first wave in 2020, taken from a number of different analyses. And you can see there's a very weak correlation between the stringency of measures and the severity of mortality from COVID-19. Having said that, I do want to point out that a meta-analysis of this type does have its work cut out because it's really simplifying the various tyrannical state interventions down to a single axis variable called stringency. And I think that's a very risky thing to do when you've got all of these different studies, lots of different countries, people with different cultures, even going down to the level of how close you stand to one another when you're having a conversation and so on. So I wouldn't set too much stock by that, but at least they've come up with some data which pushes against the lockdown narrative. Now, it's my personal belief, and I'm not trying to convince you of this, that these so-called public health restrictions have been introduced in the West to deliberately hurt the citizen. Now, that might sound like a tall claim, but consider the following. In the middle of a major pandemic, we have seen record numbers of illegal migrants crossing the Channel, many of them with COVID. As the Times reports here, COVID rife among Channel migrants, say border staff. Meanwhile, at the same time, citizens are prevented from flying abroad at times, hindered from returning home, forced into quarantine, locked in their homes, but we're just regularly importing thousands of COVID-infected migrants across the Channel. No one's doing anything about it. Interesting. We recently covered the story on our podcast of the pregnant woman from New Zealand who was forced to go to Afghanistan because New Zealand wouldn't take her, and her Belgian visa was due to expire, I believe. New Zealand has taken 779 Afghan refugees on emergency visitor visas in this period, with 1,018 people total from Afghanistan, but they couldn't take a pregnant citizen. I think that really shows you where the priorities lie. The government has also used the excuse of COVID to suspend collecting international passenger statistics, so the most recent international migration estimates get very woolly from June 2020. We also covered that they made regular exercise much more difficult by closing gyms, closing swimming pools, closing outdoor spaces, forcing you to be sedentary and locked in your home, despite all of those things being essential for good physical health, and good physical health being good for your immune system. And of course, your good immune system being good against COVID-19. Huge amounts of money have been printed and spent, resulting in large inflation rises across the West that are essentially a stealth tax on savings. Public sector spending is also very close to World War I levels as a proportion of GDP. And you can see this graph here from ukpublicspending.co.uk. So it peaked at about 55% in the middle of World War I, as you can see from the red there. And
we're at what, 52?
Yeah. And these figures aren't completely up to date, so we may have even surpassed that. But you'll notice how each time there's a war, especially World War I, it goes from very little taxation, about 10, 12, 15% taken in total, right up to 55%. And then when it comes back down, it only goes back down to 30%. Then again, World War II, it goes all the way up to 70%, but when it drops, it's only 40% of GDP. So every time there's a crisis, it never completely falls back down. The government never quite gives up all of its taxation powers. And my fervent belief is no matter how good or democratic the government is, once you go above a certain proportion of GDP, of wealth that you're stealing from the citizens, you are doomed as a regime, because people will not stand for it at some point. I don't know where that point will be, but I think the government is playing with fire here. I could go on. Another last thing I'm going to mention here is this article here, which is the US Army summarily discharging soldiers who refuse the COVID vaccine. As tensions are hotting up in Ukraine, as the rise of China becomes more of an issue on the world stage, the Biden regime reckons it just wants to summarily discharge soldiers if they're not vaccinated.
Who needs the army?
Yeah.
They're not important.
No. Now, at the moment, they have approved out of, I think, 3,000 applications for religious exemptions to the vaccine, they have approved 0. And of the, I think, about 790, I may be wrong, applications for medical exemptions, they have approved 6. So basically no one is getting off, and they are destroying these young people's careers based on whether they will or will not take a vaccine. Now, what was that thing that was really important in medical ethics until 2 years ago? Informed consent, was that it? Like not being pressured into having medical treatments done on you and being able to do it of your own free will, which, by the way, absolves the medical practitioners from the ethical quandaries of forcing treatment on you. So that's very important for medics and doctors and their consciences. Yeah, we seem to have forgotten about that recently. And a pattern has emerged whereby due to COVID becomes the unassailable excuse for any action or inaction on the part of the state, with the inconvenience to or downright betrayal of the public taken for granted. Nowadays, if you ask the government to sort something out, some local council problem, you will quite often get due to COVID, personnel shortages, resource shortages, cannot do it this time, blah, blah, blah.
Taxing you more than ever, but also all of the services no longer work.
But also the things they want to bring in get brought in at double time. And when you push back against it, they say, because of COVID, we've decided to fast track this to reduce infection rates or something. I remember in Cambridge, I brought this up before, nearby where I was living, these roadblocks appeared out of nowhere because they basically used the COVID legislation to circumvent the existing processes and fast track their plan for blocking cars out of certain roads. Now, whether you agree to that or not, it's entirely whether you're pro-car, pro-motorist, anti-car, whatever. But the fact that they did this, I found hilarious. Due to COVID, we've put roadblocks in the city. Yeah, how does that work? How is a roadblock going to reduce transmission? Yeah, you can make a roundabout argument, but... and I'm sure you watching and listening at home will have many examples that you can draw on of where your local area has been changed by local councils or government doing things or refusing to do things that would otherwise be normal. And if you thought for a moment that our dear leaders have the faintest clue what they're doing, look at this latest brilliant suggestion from the Scottish Premier. Nicola Sturgeon takes a saw to classroom doors in crackpot DIY effort to stop COVID in schools. Have you come across this, Callum?
Yeah, she's going to chop off the bottom of the door so that'll stop COVID spreading.
Yep.
Which doesn't make any sense on the face of it, but also there's a reason there's a full door there. It's called a fire door. It's meant to burn, so that it stops fire from spreading. But no, now we put a big friggin' hole in it. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I would hate to be in Scotland at the moment because the quality of governance, I know we don't have much to write home about down in England, but this kind of thing is just, it's laughable. And it's this kind of governance which will make Scotland a laughingstock if you keep the SNP in power. Chopping the bottom off each door, by the way, is expected to cost around £150 per door.
I'll do it for 100.
Yeah, resulting in an estimated total cost to taxpayers of £300,000. This is how your taxes are being spent, ladies and gentlemen. This is why people in England and Wales give money net to Scotland so they can run their own crackpot regime in the north. It's so they can spend it on vitally important life-saving safety measures like sawing the bottom off a classroom door. I just find this hilarious. Shirley Ann Somerville, the Scottish Education Secretary, wrote to MSPs informing them that around 2,000 doors could be undercut to increase airflow. In a letter to Holyrood's Education Committee, she said between 2 and 4% of rooms across Scotland's schools and nurseries had been identified as having problematic carbon dioxide levels because of inadequate ventilation. Open a window? I don't know. I'm just suggesting. I know Scotland's cold, but if you've got carbon dioxide problems, if that's the real reason for the SNP's education policy failures.
You know the neat things about doors? Got these handles on them. You can open the door, and you can put like a little bit of wood or whatever underneath. There you are. Don't have to chop the door in half. It's now open. You got your airflow.
Yeah, exactly. That's what another person suggests. But anyway, she continues. She said this was the equivalent of around 2,000 classrooms, and £5 million would now be spent trying to improve their airflow using filtration units, extraction fans, and chopping the bottom off doors. Willie Rennie, the former Scottish Liberal Democrat leader, attacked the SNP for only acting to improve ventilation nearly 2 years after the pandemic had started, and argued that schools deserved a better solution than having their doors shortened. The move emerged the day after Nicola Sturgeon refused again to allow secondary pupils to remove face masks in classrooms, claiming the change was still premature, despite it being made in England on January the 20th. So they're still forcing kids to wear masks in Scotland. They're going to chop the bottom off doors, although they since backtracked on that, because, as you pointed out, firefighters came up and said, hang on a minute, this is going to increase the fire risk. And I feel this is a real mark of how ludicrous civilization has got, that the level of discourse in this country is you can only counter one dumb safety measure with another type of safety argument. It's like safety is the trump card in the deck of policy reasons here, so you have to come up with a safety reason to do anything. And that just strikes me as a path to madness, because you end up tied up in health and safety restrictions until the end. Another MSP wondered why teachers can't simply wedge the door open, for a sweet cost to the taxpayer of sod all. But why not spend taxpayers' money when you could spend taxpayers' money? And of course, while the state has been busy using your money to implement all of these nutty, oppressive diktats, they've been continuously flouting the same restrictions that you're forced to abide by. Let's remind ourselves, finally, of the more egregious lockdown breakers. Oh, look at that. Who did we mention at the start of this article? It's Neil Ferguson. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Wonder if you remember at home. Government scientist Neil Ferguson resigns after breaking lockdown rules to meet his married lover. Ferguson allowed the woman to visit him at home during the lockdown while lecturing the public on the need for strict social distancing. So yeah, it's not just politicians, it's these scientists, these unelected, very powerful scientists as well. Way before the vaccine, right at the start of the pandemic, this man's modelling predicted 500,000 deaths, and his revealed preferences show he didn't believe a word of it. But he still used it to lock us down. There's another one here, which I think is interesting to talk about. Rita Ora, the pop star, has apologised for a second breach of the UK's COVID-19 restrictions after failing to self-isolate following a trip to Egypt. The 30-year-old flew to Egypt for a private corporate performance on 21st November. On her return the following day, she should have isolated for 2 weeks. Instead, she threw a birthday party in London, which was itself in violation of lockdown rules. Now, I'm actually more sympathetic in Rita's case because she's neither a politician nor a scientist. She doesn't make the rules. She's just breaking them. However, the cost for her doing this is a fine of £10,000. It's generally true that whenever the punishment for non-compliance is a fine, this is designed to control the lower and middle class, because the wealthy, like Rita, can simply shrug it off. £10,000? I think I've got some small change. In general, when the rules are arbitrary and tyrannical, you could argue, YouTube, that there is a moral imperative not to comply. But of course, if you or I behaved in the same way, a £10,000 fine would be rather a big deal, unlike Rita. And I'm not ragging on Rita here, I'm just using her example to point out the difference between the rich and the poor when it comes to these restrictions. But one person I am going to rag on is Kay Burley. Exclusive, I am an idiot. Kay Burley sent grovelling email to Sky News colleagues after she was suspended for 6 months over 60th birthday party COVID rule breach on full pay. I think she should have lost her job for this personally.
I want that on a Wikipedia page. Just,
Yes.
Famous quotes.
I'm
Kay
an
Burley.
idiot,
I'm
quote
an
Kay
idiot.
Burley.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we were saying earlier that the media classes should not be let off the hook, even as they're ragging on the government. And they absolutely shouldn't be, because this was not long after whipping up the furore over following COVID restrictions that ended up getting Dominic Cummings removed from Downing Street. Do you remember what did he do? He drove up north to drop his kids off at their grandparents and stopped off at a station, and there was something about it, a positive COVID test. It was against the regulations and so on. So having done that and participated in months and months and months, now 2 years of COVID fear-mongering from the mainstream media, Kay just flouted the rules to have a massive birthday party with all of her mates. And this is the map of it in the next image. So you can see they're jumping all around London, Soho, Mayfair, all of these places straight after curfew. And she claims she just used the toilets there, but I believe when we covered this, it seemed like there was a rather extensive party going on, starting, of course, with dinner at a private members club in Soho.
It always does.
Yep. Yet again, there is no shortage of elite support for plebeian restrictions. They themselves follow a different set of rules, and their revealed preferences show that they never believed COVID was a threat to them. Finally, of course, there are the politicians, and here's just some of the parties they enjoyed through all of this. I've got an extract from the party's timeline at Downing Street. 13th November 2020, Johnson's chief aide Cummings leaves number 10 clutching a box of his belongings halfway through the second national lockdown. According to Mr. Cummings, a party then took place in the Downing Street flat where the Prime Minister lives with his wife. 27th of November. Mr. Johnson gives a speech at a leaving party for a member of staff in Downing Street during the second national lockdown. 16th of December. Tier 3 restrictions come into effect in London, which is another way of saying total lockdown, meaning people were not allowed to mix indoors with anyone outside their household or support bubble. 2 days later, a party takes place in Downing Street with 40 people in attendance. I mean, need I say more? I think this has been trammeled all throughout the media. People are aware of this. We all have our eyes on government for their lockdown breaches. And yes, sure, these are egregious. They should be held to account. But let's not forget the scientists who are also flouting the rules from start to finish, or the elite establishment media class, exempted, by the way, from the business closures that have shut down many small, medium businesses, who were partying it up in London amid a national lockdown. During this time, thousands of ordinary British people were dying alone, many of them not from COVID, but from normal old age illness or other causes. But they were dying alone because hospital staff, carers, etc. would not allow relatives to visit. Even the Queen was forced to hold a minimal funeral for her husband of 70 years. And we have this photo here just encapsulating what the whole rest of the country was doing, that was sticking to the rules, while the people making them were laughing in our faces.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the premium podcast we sometimes do, a sort of live hangout, and this one you can see here is I, for one, welcome our racist AI overlords, in which we take a look at the very racist AIs that are out there. And if you want to follow Carl, you can follow him on Getter at Carl Benjamin on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.